One summer afternoon, I arrived at my parents' house in suburban southeast London, armed with some glassware that I'd ordered online and a pack of 6 Mr. Kipling Bramley apple pies. I was there to do what is probably the silliest experiment I've ever attempted. As a child, my dad was a keen amateur chemist and used to spend happy afternoons in the mid-1960s creating smells and explosions in the shed at the bottom of his parents' garden. Those were the days when anyone, including teenagers in possession of an advanced knowledge of chemistry and a healthy disregard for their own safety, could buy a terrifying array of noxious substances from their local chemical supplier. This, it turned out, included all the ingredients of gunpowder. He still recalls with some relish how one of his more dramatic experiments was brought to an abrupt end when his own father, a former artilleryman not unaccustomed to the sound of gunfire, stormed to the bottom of the garden shouting, "That's enough! That one rattled the windows!" Simpler times. My dad still has some of his old chemistry equipment, including a Bunsen burner that I wanted to get my hands on, and I decided that my small London flat was probably not the ideal location for the experiment I had in mind. The thought behind the experiment was this. If you were presented with an apple pie and had no knowledge of pies, apples, or their composition, what might you do to try to figure out what it was made from? On the workbench in the garage, I scraped a small sample of the pie into a test tube, taking care to get a good mix of the crumbly pastry and the soft apple filling, and then sealed it with a cork that had a small hole drilled through the middle. After connecting the tube to a second flask floating in a tub of cold water via a long L-shaped glass pipe, we fired up the Bunsen burner, popped it under the test tube, and stood back. The pie began to bubble and caramelize, and soon the expanding gas within the test tube threatened to force our sample up into the connecting pipe. Reducing the heat slightly, we watched the pie slowly start to blacken, and to my delight, tendrils of mist started to flow along the pipe and pour into the waiting flask, which before long was overflowing with a ghostly white vapour. Now this was a real chemistry experiment. Wondering what this white mist might be, I gave it a whiff, a tried and tested method of chemical analysis from before the days of health and safety. Humphrey Davy, a pioneering chemist of the Romantic Age, famously investigated the medical effects of various gases by inhaling them, which in 1799 led him to discover the pleasurable effects of nitrous oxide, what we now know as laughing gas, which he would inhale in large quantities while locked in a dark room with his poet friends, or sometimes young women of his acquaintance. Mind you, it wasn't a risk-free strategy. He came close to killing himself during an experiment with carbon monoxide, and on being dragged into the open air remarked faintly, "I do not think I shall die." Alas, my apple pie vapour didn't produce any psychoactive effects, just an extremely unpleasant burnt smell that seemed to hang around for hours afterwards. Peering through the mist to the bottom of the flask, I found that some parts of the vapour had condensed on contact with the cool water bath, forming a yellowish liquid covered by a dark brown, oily film. After about 10 minutes of intense heating, no more vapour seemed to be coming off the charred remains of the apple pie, and so we concluded that our experiment was complete. In my keenness to inspect the contents of the test tube, I briefly forgot that when you heat glass with a Bunsen flame for 10 minutes, it gets really quite hot, and badly burned my index finger. There's a good reason why the most dangerous bit of equipment I'm generally allowed near is a desktop computer. After a much longer wait, I gingerly returned to the test tube and tipped its contents onto the bench. The apple pie had been reduced to a jet-black, rock-like substance whose surface was slightly shiny in places. So, what can we conclude about the composition of apple pie from this admittedly rather silly experiment? Well, we've ended up with 3 different substances, a black solid, a yellow liquid, and a white gas, which by now had infused my skin, hair, and clothes with a nauseating burn smell. I admit that the precise chemical composition of these 3 apple pie components was not entirely clear to me at the time, though I was pretty sure that the black stuff was charcoal and that the yellowish liquid is probably mostly water. To get further towards a list of fundamental apple pie ingredients, we are going to need to do some more advanced chemical analysis.